This is the story of a weekend that went wrong, of a darkness that swallowed 4 friends whole, leaving behind only the echo of their screams against the stone. The air in the car had grown stale with the scent of cheap coffee and the collective, unspoken anxiety of a road trip stretching into its 6th hour. Outside, the lush, rolling hills of the interior had flattened into a grim, windswept coastline. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a moody canvas of purple and grey that threatened a storm. "Are we sure this is it?" Ben asked from the back seat, his voice a tight wire of forced cheerfulness. He lowered his phone, a frown creasing his brow. "Because according to this, we are about to drive directly into the ocean, which, you know, is not on my bucket list." Liam, gripping the steering wheel, did not take his eyes off the narrow, pockmarked road. The directions said it ends at a private dock. "That is where we meet the boatman." He glanced at the GPS on the dashboard, its cheery female voice having fallen silent 20 minutes ago. The screen just showed their car as a tiny blue arrow suspended in a vast expanse of pale green. "Lost. St. Jude's Folly," Maya murmured from beside Ben, her face illuminated by the glow of her tablet. "Patron saint of lost causes. Appropriates." She was the group's resident historian, the one who had unearthed the rental listing for the decommissioned lighthouse on some obscure heritage preservation website. It had sounded like a perfect escape. 4 university friends, a remote lighthouse, a weekend of splendid isolation before the final push of their senior year. Chloe, in the passenger seat, shivered and pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She was an artist, a creature of light and color, who was already finding the landscape oppressive. The trees were stunted, bent into permanent submission by the relentless sea wind. The grass was a pale, sickly yellow. "It just feels empty out here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Liam reached over and squeezed her hand. His was warm and steady. "That is the point, Chloe. No people, no deadlines, no noise. Just us and the sea." He was the anchor of their group, the pragmatist who saw solutions where others saw problems. He had seen the lighthouse as a challenge, a rugged adventure. The road finally ended at a rickety wooden pier that jutted out into a churning slate-grey sea. An old man with a face like a road map of wrinkles and a beard stained yellow with nicotine was waiting for them, leaning against a piling. His boat, a small, weathered trawler named the Sea Serpent, bobbed uneasily in the water. "You the ones for the Folly," he grunted, his voice a gravelly rasp. He did not wait for an answer, instead grabbing their bags with a surprising strength and tossing them into the boat. "Storm is coming. Best be quick about it." The journey to the island was short but violent. The boat pitched and rolled, and the air filled with the sting of salt spray. The lighthouse grew steadily on the horizon, a grey stone needle piercing the clouds. It stood alone on a jagged outcrop of black rock, a solitary sentinel against the fury of the ocean. It looked less like a beacon and more like a prison. "Not much for visitors, are you?" Ben shouted over the roar of the engine, trying to strike up a conversation with the boatman. The old man, Silas, just spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the waves. "The Folly keeps to itself. Best to let it." His eyes, pale and watery, lingered on them for a moment, Some places have memories. The Folly, it has got scars. He offered no further explanation. When they reached the small, crude dock at the base of the rock, he helped them unload their supplies in silence. Liam handed him a wad of cash. Silas counted it slowly, then stuffed it into his pocket. "I will be back Sunday, noon," he said, already untying his boat. Weather permitting. He paused, his hand on the rope. Lock the door at night, not to keep anyone out, to keep everything in. Before Liam could ask what he meant, Silas had started the engine and was pulling away, leaving the four of them standing on the slippery rocks, the lighthouse looming over them like a tombstone. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the shriek of the wind and the crash of waves against the shore. "Well," Ben said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the open space. He was a bucket of sunshine. The key Liam had been sent was old and iron, heavy in his palm. It fit into a massive oak door, bound with rusted metal straps. The lock groaned in protest, the sound of metal grinding against metal, before finally clicking open. The door swung inward on complaining hinges, revealing the cavernous base of the lighthouse. The air that rushed out to meet them was cold and smelled of damp stone, salt, and something else, something vaguely organic and unpleasant, like old wet wool. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through a high, grimy window. A spiral staircase, its iron steps worn smooth in the center, clung to the curved wall, ascending up into the darkness. "Home, sweet home," Liam announced, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice. He flicked a switch on the wall. A single, bare bulb sputtered to life, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and crawl along the walls. They spent the next hour hauling their gear inside and exploring their temporary home. The ground floor was a single large room with a small functional kitchen in one corner and a sitting area with mismatched threadbare furniture in another. Above that, 2 floors each held a Spartan bedroom and a small, grim bathroom. Everything was clean in a purely functional sense, but felt deeply unloved. The stone walls seemed to leach the warmth from the air, and every sound, every footstep, every cough echoed and amplified. Chloe ran a hand along the rough wall. "You can feel the history here," she said, her artist's soul intrigued despite her unease. "Imagine being the keeper. Out here, all alone, with just the storm for company." Maya, who had already claimed a corner of the sitting area for her research, looked up from her tablet. His name was Thomas Weaver. He was the last keeper, before the light was automated. He lived here for 30 years with his wife Elara. "Happy couple?" Ben asked, peering into a cupboard that held a few chipped mugs and a tin of hardened coffee. "Not according to the local legends," Maya said, her eyes glinting with academic curiosity. "They say she went mad from the isolation, the constant sound of the wind, the loneliness. One night, during a storm much like the one we are about to have, she threw herself from the lantern room at the very top. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Chloe wrapped her arms around herself. Liam shot Maya a look, a silent plea to change the subject. "It is just a ghost story, guys," Liam said, forcing a laugh. "Every old place has one. It is part of the charm." He clapped his hands together. "Right, Who wants to help me make some dinner? I am thinking chili. Something to warm us up. As they set about preparing the meal, a sense of forced normalcy settled over them. They put on music from a portable speaker. The familiar tunes a thin shield against the oppressive silence of the lighthouse. But even as they chopped vegetables and opened cans, the building seemed to watch them. The shadows in the corners were a little too deep. The wind whistling through the cracks in the stone sounded disconcertingly like a human whisper. Chloe was grating cheese when she felt it. A sudden, intense pocket of cold. It was as if someone had opened a freezer door right behind her. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She gasped and spun around, the grater clattering onto the floor. There was nothing there, just the empty, curved wall of the lighthouse. "You okay?" Liam asked, rushing to her side. I do not know. It just got so cold all of a sudden." Liam put his arm around her. "It is this place. It is a giant stone tube in the middle of the ocean. It is bound to be drafty." He kissed her forehead, but she could see the flicker of concern in his eyes. Later, as they were eating, Maya found what she had been looking for. Tucked away on a small, dusty bookshelf was a thick, leather-bound volume, the keeper's logbook. "Oh, wow," she breathed, her historian's heart fluttering. "This is incredible. This could be the actual log of Thomas Weaver." She opened it carefully, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was a neat, looping cursive. "Read some of it," Ben urged, leaning forward. Maya cleared her throat. October 12th, 1923. The supply boat brought news from the mainland. Another pointless war bruise in Europe. Here, the only war is with the sea. She is a relentless foe. The light is my only weapon. Elara grows quiet. She watches the waves for hours. I fear this place is draining the light from her as well. She flipped through a few pages. His entries get shorter, more frantic. She read another. November 3rd, 1923. The storm has raged for 3 days. The wind shrieks her name. Elara, Elara. She does not sleep. She hums a tune I do not know. A sad, simple melody. When I ask her what it is, she just smiles and says it is a song the stones taught her. A collective shiver went through the group. The chili suddenly felt cold in their stomachs. The music from the speaker had ended, and the only sounds were the howling wind and the rhythmic crash of waves. "Maybe you should put that away," Chloe said, her voice thin. "It is fascinating," Maya insisted, though her own face had grown pale. It was then that they heard it, a faint sound from upstairs. A soft, mournful cry, almost lost in the gale. It sounded like a woman weeping. They all froze, eyes wide, looking at each other. "It is the wind," Liam said immediately, his voice a little too loud, a little too certain. "It is just the wind blowing through a window frame or something. Old buildings make noises." "It did not sound like the wind," Ben whispered, his usual humor completely gone. "I will go check," Liam said, standing up. "Probably just a loose shutter on one of the bedroom windows." He took a heavy flashlight from his bag and started up the spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing in the sudden tense silence. The others watched him go, their breath held. They could see the beam of his light sweeping across the walls as he ascended. He was gone for what felt like an eternity. When he finally returned, his face was set in a determinedly neutral expression. "Nothing," he announced. "All the windows are sealed tight. It was the wind. I am telling you." They tried to believe him. They wanted to believe him. But the seed of fear had been planted. It was a cold, hard knot in their stomachs that no amount of rational explanation could dissolve. The rest of the evening was a strained affair. Ben's jokes fell flat. Maya put the logbook away, but it sat on the table, a silent, menacing presence. Chloe sketched restlessly in her notepad, her charcoal pencils making harsh, angry lines on the page. Liam busied himself with cleaning up, his movements brisk and efficient, as if he could scrub the unease from the very air. Around 10, Chloe let out a small, choked cry. The others looked at her. She was staring down at her sketchbook, her hand covering her mouth. "What is it?" Liam asked, kneeling beside her. She pushed the book towards him. On the page was a drawing. It was the spiral staircase, but at the very top, shrouded in shadow, stood a figure. A tall, slender woman with long, dark hair that obscured her face, one hand resting on the railing as if she were about to descend. The drawing was detailed and deeply unsettling. "I did not draw this," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "I was just doodling, making patterns." I looked down, and it was just there. Liam stared at the drawing, his skepticism finally beginning to crumble. The figure in the sketch was looking directly at the viewer, even though it had no visible eyes. "Okay," he said, his voice low and serious. "That is it. We are all tired. This place is getting to us. Let us just go to bed. Things will look better in the morning." No one argued. The thought of being alone was terrifying, but the thought of staying together in that oppressive room was somehow worse. They trudged up the stairs to their respective floors, the lighthouse seeming to hold its breath around them. Liam and Chloe were on the first floor, Ben and Maya on the second. Before going into their room, Liam checked the main door at the base of the tower one last time. He pulled the heavy oak door shut, slid the thick iron bolt across, and turned the massive key in the lock. He rattled the handle. It was solid, secure. In their room, the sound of the storm was even louder. The wind hammered against the thick glass of the window, and the waves below sounded like the roar of some great beast. Chloe changed and climbed into the cold bed without a word. Liam followed, pulling her into his arms. He could feel her trembling. "It is going to be okay," he whispered into her hair, though the words felt hollow even to him. "It is just our minds playing tricks on us." She did not answer. Eventually her trembling subsided, and her breathing deepened into the rhythm of a troubled sleep. Liam, however, remained wide awake. He lay on his back, staring up into the impenetrable darkness, listening. Every creak of the old structure, every moan of the wind, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. He thought of Silas the boatman's warning, lock the door at night, to keep everything in. Hours passed. The storm raged on, a relentless assault on their stone sanctuary. Sometime after midnight, just as exhaustion was finally beginning to claim him, a new sound cut through the chaos of the gale. It was from downstairs, a soft rhythmic knock. He froze, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs. It was a quiet sound, but clear and deliberate. Someone or something was knocking at the main door, but that was impossible. They were on an island. The boatman was long gone. The sea was a maelstrom. He slid carefully out of bed, trying not to wake Chloe. The floor was ice cold beneath his bare feet. He crept to the door of their room and opened it a crack. The central column of the lighthouse was pitch black, a vertical tunnel of nothingness. He could still hear the knocking, patient and persistent. His first thought was Ben, playing a stupid prank to try and break the tension. But this did not feel like a prank. There was no mirth in it. He made his way to the top of the stairs and peered down. Nothing. He went down to the next landing and listened at Ben and Maya's door. From inside, he could hear Ben's soft, rhythmic snores. They were both asleep. A cold dread, colder than the stone floor, washed over him. He was the only one awake. Slowly, his body screaming in protest, he descended the spiral staircase. The knocking had stopped. The silence it left behind was somehow more terrifying. As he reached the bottom, he could see a thin sliver of pale grey light framing the main door. A sliver of light that should not have been there. He reached the ground floor and stopped dead. The massive oak door, the door he had bolted and locked himself, stood slightly ajar. It was open just enough to let in a draft of frigid, salt-laced air that swirled around his ankles. The heavy iron bolt was slid back. The key was still in the lock, but it was turned to the unlocked position. His blood ran cold. He took a hesitant step forward and peered through the opening. The world outside was a chaos of wind and rain and spray. The black rocks were slick and treacherous, illuminated in brief ghostly flashes of lightning. There was nothing out there. No boat, no person, just the raging storm. With a trembling hand, he pulled the door shut. The sound of it closing seemed deafening. He slid the bolt across, his fingers clumsy and numb. He turned the key, the metallic click echoing in the cavernous space, and then, for good measure, he dragged one of the heavy armchairs from the sitting area and wedged it under the door handle. He backed away slowly, his eyes scanning the deep shadows that clung to the base of the lighthouse. He felt watched. He felt a presence in the darkness with him, something ancient and malevolent. He turned and fled back up the stairs, taking them two at a time, not stopping until he was safely back in his room with the door shut behind him. He did not lock it. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would not make any difference. He slipped back into bed, his body rigid with fear. Chloe murmured in her sleep and rolled over, oblivious. Liam lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening. He listened to the storm. He listened to the groans of the old lighthouse, and he listened for the knocking to start again, his heart a frantic drumbeat, counting down the seconds in a nightmare that had only just begun. Sleep was an impossible luxury now. They were trapped. They were not alone. Chapter 2. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind did not die down so much as it simply ceased, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and unnatural. Liam had not slept. He had spent the long hours listening to every groan and sigh of the ancient stone tower, his body coiled tight with a primal fear he had never known. He watched the grey, anemic light of morning seep through the window, illuminating Chloe's sleeping face. She looked so peaceful, so unaware of the open door, of the impossible violation of their sanctuary. For a moment, he envied her ignorance. Then, the weight of what he had to tell them settled back onto his chest, heavy as a shroud. He waited until the others had straggled downstairs, their faces pale and puffy from restless sleep. The air was thick with a shared, unspoken dread. Ben tried to make a joke about the coffee tasting like battery acid, but his laughter was a hollow, brittle thing that shattered against the quiet. Maya was already at the table, her hands hovering over the keeper's logbook as if drawn by a morbid gravity. Liam cleared his throat. The small sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. Something happened last night, he began, his voice rough from exhaustion. After you were all asleep, 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him. He told them everything. The knocking, the unlocked door, the heavy chair he had wedged against it, which now sat back in its original place, as if he had only imagined moving it. As he spoke, he watched their faces. Ben's forced smile melted away, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. Maya's brow furrowed, her analytical mind scrambling for a logical explanation. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes, wide and terrified, filled with tears. "Maybe you were sleepwalking," Maya suggested, her voice lacking its usual academic confidence. "Stress, a new environment, it can trigger things like that." "I was not sleeping," Liam said, his tone sharp. "I was wide awake. I heard it. I saw it." "So what are you saying?" Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. "A ghost came and unlocked the door just to mess with us." The question was meant to be sarcastic, a return to his usual cynical self, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "I am saying I locked that door," Liam insisted, his gaze unwavering. "And something opened it." Chloe began to cry softly, a desperate, hiccuping sound. "I want to go home, Liam. I want to go home now." "We cannot, Chloe," he said gently, his heart aching at her distress. "Silas is not coming back until Sunday. There is no signal. We just have to hold on." The words hung in the air, a grim pronouncement of their predicament. They were trapped, not just by the sea, but with something that defied explanation. The pretense of a fun weekend adventure had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw and terrifying reality. Unable to bear the tension, Maya turned her attention back to the logbook, her fingers tracing the faded script, as if the ink itself held the answers. "Maybe there is something in here," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. A pattern, an explanation. She flipped past the entries she had read the night before, her eyes scanning the increasingly agitated handwriting. Thomas Weaver's neat cursive had devolved into a desperate scrawl. "December 1st, 1923, she read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. The humming. It is constant now, a sad, thin sound that winds its way down the stairs. Elara says she does not hear it, but I see her tapping her fingers to its rhythm when she thinks I am not looking. The tune gets inside your head. I caught myself humming it today while cleaning the lens. It felt like another man's song in my mouth. She paused, swallowing hard. The memory of Chloe's mindless humming the night before was fresh in all their minds. "Listen to this," Maya continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. December 5th, 1923. I saw her on the rocks again, in the heart of the storm. The waves were crashing over the dock, but she was standing there, her white nightdress plastered to her skin, her hair like black seaweed in the wind. She was beckoning to me. I screamed her name, but she did not answer. When I ran downstairs, the door was bolted from the inside. She was sitting at the table, dry as bone, asking me why I was shouting. Ben let out a shaky breath. He was losing his mind. The isolation drove him crazy. Or he was seeing what was really there. Chloe whispered, hugging her knees to her chest. Maya turned a few more fragile pages. The ink was smeared in places, blurred by what looked like tear stains or droplets of seawater. His last entry, the last one that is readable anyway. It is dated December 12th. Her eyes scanned the page, growing wider with each word. "Oh God. What?" Liam demanded. "Read it. The light is out." Maya read, her voice a strained rasp. "The storm took it. Or she did. She is in the lantern room. She is always in the lantern room, waiting for me in the dark." The humming has stopped. Now there is only the weeping. I cannot bear it. I cannot leave her alone up there. I must go to her. I must put out the other light, the one in my own head. After that, the pages were a chaotic mess of ink blots, frantic slashes, and spirals that mimicked the lighthouse's staircase. The final few pages were stuck together, fused by a stiff, brown stain that Maya did not want to analyze too closely. She closed the book with a sharp snap, dust puffing from its covers. The history she had been so eager to uncover had become a threat, a blueprint for their own unfolding horror. The day dragged on under a sky the color of lead. The strange, oppressive calm outside was a mockery of the storm brewing within the lighthouse walls. No one knew what to do. They were a bundle of frayed nerves, starting at every creak and groan of the old building. They tried to play cards, but the silence between each turn was deafening. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist in the periphery of their vision. The humming started around noon. It was faint at first, barely audible over the distant murmur of the sea. A high, ethereal and deeply sorrowful melody. It was the tune Chloe had hummed, the one from the logbook. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing down the central column of the lighthouse. "Do you hear that?" Ben whispered, his eyes wide, the playing cards frozen in his hand. They all heard it. It was a simple, looping melody of only a few notes, but it was filled with an unbearable sadness. It was the sound of utter despair. "Make it stop," Chloe pleaded, pressing her hands over her ears. Liam, spurred to action, jumped to his feet. "It is coming from upstairs." He started up the spiral staircase, determined to find a rational source, a draft playing over a bottle, the wind in a chimney, anything. The others followed close behind, unwilling to be left alone. As they ascended, the humming grew slightly louder, clearer. It seemed to be coming from the second floor. They reached the landing, their hearts pounding in unison. The humming was right there, seeming to emanate from the empty air in front of them. And then, as they all stood there, listening, it simply faded away into silence. They stood frozen, straining their ears, but there was nothing, only the sound of their own ragged breathing. They searched both bedrooms, the bathroom, and looked for any possible source. They found nothing. No radios, no vents, no rational explanation. They returned to the ground floor, the humming replaced by a silence that was now ringing with its absence. The melody, however, was stuck in their heads, a persistent, ghostly earworm. An hour later, Ben let out a yell of frustration. "Where is it? Where is my phone?" He had left it on the small table next to the armchair he was sitting in. He had been scrolling through his photos, a desperate attempt to connect with a world that now seemed a million miles away. He had set it down not 30 seconds ago. Now it was gone. "Did one of you take it?" he demanded, his voice edged with panic. "This is not funny." They all denied it. They helped him search, turning over cushions, checking under the furniture. It was nowhere to be found. "This is insane," Ben muttered, running his hands through his hair. It was Maya who found it. She had wandered over to the kitchen area to get a glass of water. The phone was sitting in the middle of the small, scarred wooden countertop. It was nowhere near where Ben had been sitting. "How did it get here?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. He picked it up as if it might be hot to the touch. "I was right over there. None of you came over here. Maybe you got up and put it there without thinking," Liam offered, but his suggestion sounded weak even to his own ears. The space between the chair and the kitchen was not a path anyone had taken. The accusation hung unspoken in the air. One of them was lying, or something else had moved it. The first possibility was terrifying, suggesting a mind was fracturing under the pressure. The second was infinitely worse. The fragile bonds of their friendship began to fray. Suspicion crept into their glances. They were all on edge, irritable and terrified. The lighthouse was no longer just a creepy location. It was an active participant in their torment, a malevolent entity that was isolating them and turning them against each other. The breaking point for Chloe came in the late afternoon. The light was beginning to fail, the grey sky deepening towards dusk. She was standing near one of the high, narrow windows, staring out at the churning sea, her sketchbook clutched in her hands like a shield. Liam was watching her, worried by her catatonic stillness. He saw her whole body go rigid. A small, sharp gasp escaped her lips. She stumbled backward, away from the window, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it stole her voice. "Chloe, what is it? What did you see?" Liam rushed to her side, grabbing her arms to steady her. She pointed a trembling finger at the window. "A woman," she finally managed to choke out, her voice a strangled whisper. In the reflection, she was standing right behind me. She began to sob, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had long, dark hair. It was covering her face. "Oh God, Liam, she was right there." Liam spun and looked at the window. He saw only his own frantic reflection, and Chloe's terrified face, ghostly images superimposed over the grey, roiling sea. There was no one else, but then he saw something else. On the dusty stone floor, leading from the base of the massive front door to the bottom of the spiral staircase, was a trail of wet footprints. They were dark against the pale grey stone, perfectly formed. They were small, delicate prints, the kind a barefoot woman might make. And as they all stared, their breath catching in their throats, the footprints began to disappear. They did not smudge or fade. They simply vanished, one by one, evaporating into the cold, damp air, until nothing remained but the bare, empty stone. That was it. The last shred of doubt, the final thread of rational explanation, was gone. They were not alone. The story of Elara Weaver was not a story, it was a warning. "I am getting us out of here," Liam declared, his voice a low, determined growl. He was filled with a sudden, furious energy, a potent cocktail of fear and guilt. He had brought them here. He had dismissed their fears. It was his responsibility to get them home. "How?" Maya asked, her face ashen. "The boat does not come for 2 more days. We signal for help," he said, his mind racing. "A passing ship, a fishing boat, anything. We can use the light." "The light is broken, Liam," Maya reminded him gently. "The logbook said so. It has been out for 100 years. Not the main light," he said, pointing up. "The emergency beacon. There has to be one. A modern, battery-powered one. We just have to get to the lantern room and figure out how to turn it on." A sliver of hope cut through the despair. It was a plan. It was action. It was something other than waiting in the dark to be terrorized. But the thought of climbing that spiral staircase all the way to the top, to the room where Elara had waited in the dark, was a terrifying prospect. Ben, however, seemed to latch onto the idea. "I will go," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I need to do something. I cannot just sit here waiting for ghosts to steal my phone." It was a desperate bravado, a last-ditch effort to reclaim some sense of control. "I will go with you," Liam said. "No," Ben insisted, shaking his head. "You stay with Chloe. She needs you. Maya, you keep reading that thing. See if it says anything about how it can be stopped." Before Liam could argue, Ben was gone, taking a heavy flashlight and jogging up the spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing a frantic, metallic rhythm. The sound grew fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the immensity of the tower. Liam turned to Chloe, who was still shaking, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting the woman to reappear at any moment. He led her to one of the armchairs and sat with her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, murmuring useless words of comfort. Maya, looking pale but resolute, reopened the logbook, her fear momentarily sublimated by a desperate search for knowledge. High above them, Ben emerged into the lantern room. 'Twas a circular chamber encased in glass, offering a dizzying 360-degree view of the tumultuous sea and the bruised sky. In the center stood the magnificent, monstrous lens, a multifaceted beehive of glass designed to magnify a single flame into a life-saving beam. It was dark now, covered in a century of grime and salt spray. The air was frigid, and the wind moaned as it pressed against the thick glass panes. He scanned the horizon, his eyes straining to see anything, any sign of life in the vast emptiness. There was nothing, just endless grey waves cresting with white foam. He turned his attention to the room itself, searching for the emergency beacon Liam had mentioned. He found a metal box on the wall with a large red switch. It looked modern, out of place among the rust and decay. Hope surged in his chest. He reached for the switch, but as his fingers brushed the cold metal, the temperature in the room plummeted. The warmth was sucked from the air in an instant. His breath plumed in front of him in a white cloud. A profound and unnatural silence fell, the sound of the wind and sea completely cut off, as if he were suddenly encased in a vacuum. He felt a presence behind him. It was an absolute certainty. A primal instinct screaming that he was no longer alone. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a static malevolence. The fine hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He froze, his hand hovering over the switch, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. A cold breath, smelling of the deep ocean and damp graves, whispered against the shell of his ear. Then came a single, sibilant word, a woman's voice, so close it seemed to be spoken from inside his own mind. Jump. An unimaginable terror seized him. He did not scream. The sound was trapped in his throat, a strangled knot of fear. He scrambled away from the wall, away from the glass, stumbling backward and falling hard onto the iron floor. He crab-walked away from the voice, his eyes wide, fixed on the empty space where the presence had been. He could still feel its coldness, its utter hatred. He got to his feet and fled, not even looking back, plunging down the spiral staircase, his breath coming in ragged, terrified sobs. At the exact same moment, on the ground floor, Chloe, who had been rocking silently in Liam's arms, went still, her head tilted to one side, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. A strange, serene smile touched her lips, and then she began to hum. It was the melody, the sad, simple tune from the logbook. She hummed it perfectly, her voice clear and sweet and utterly devoid of emotion. "Chloe," Liam said, shaking her gently. "Chloe, stop it." Her eyes were open, but they were vacant, staring at something far away. She continued to hum, her body limp in his arms. Suddenly, the single bare bulb that lit the room flickered violently. It buzzed and sparked, casting the room in a strobe of light and shadow, making everything jump and stutter. Liam, Maya, Chloe, they were all caught in the frantic dying pulse of the light. Then, with a final, audible pop, the bulb went out. The entire lighthouse was plunged into a deep, disorienting darkness. The only illumination was the faint, ghostly twilight filtering through the grimy windows, barely enough to render the world in shades of charcoal and black. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The humming had stopped. Then from the top of the tower, From the darkness high above, a new sound began. It was not the wind, it was not a whisper. It was the clear, unmistakable sound of a woman weeping. A sound of profound, heart-wrenching grief and despair that echoed down the stone throat of the lighthouse, washing over them, surrounding them, filling the utter darkness with its sorrow and its rage. Chapter 3. The darkness was absolute. It was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed all light and sound, leaving only the chilling echo of a woman's cry. For a long moment, they were paralyzed, 4 statues carved from fear. Their world shrunk to the sound of their own frantic heartbeats and the disembodied weeping that cascaded down the spiral stairs. Liam was the first to move. His hands, slick with a cold sweat, fumbled in his pockets for his phone. The simple, familiar shape was an anchor in the terrifying blackness. His thumb found the button. A beam of harsh white light sliced through the dark, impossibly bright and painfully inadequate. It illuminated a small circle of the stone floor, the corner of a dusty armchair, Maya's face frozen in a mask of terror. "Flashlights," Liam yelled, his voice cracking. "Get your flashlights on." The command broke the spell. More beams of light cut through the gloom, shaky and erratic, sweeping across the room like searchlights at a prison break. They revealed Chloe, curled into a tight ball on the floor, her body trembling, her eyes squeezed shut as if she could block out the horror by refusing to see it. And they revealed the empty space where Ben should have been. A frantic clatter of footsteps echoed from above, growing louder, more desperate. It was a sound of pure panic, a chaotic descent that sent shivers of dread down their spines. Ben came stumbling into the weak circle of their lights, his face streaked with tears, his chest heaving with ragged, desperate breaths. "It spoke to me," he gasped, his eyes wild and unfocused. He collapsed onto his knees, his body shaking violently. Up there, in the lantern room. A voice. It told me to jump. He clutched his head, his knuckles white. The weeping. It is her. She was right behind me. I felt her. Oh God, I felt her breath. His breakdown was the final confirmation. The last vestiges of their ordinary world had been burned away, leaving only the stark, unbelievable truth of their situation. The ghost was real, and it was trying to kill them. The weeping from above continued, a constant, sorrowful lament that seemed to seep into the very stones of the lighthouse, vibrating through the soles of their feet. It was a sound that scraped away at their sanity. "We cannot stay here," Liam said, his voice a low, urgent command. He grabbed Ben by the arm, hauling him to his feet. The ground floor was too exposed. The massive front door, which had already proven to be no obstacle, felt like a gaping wound in their defenses. "We have to get upstairs, barricade ourselves in one of the rooms." "Upstairs," Ben croaked, his eyes darting towards the top of the dark spiral, closer to her. "It is better than being down here," Liam insisted. "We can block a bedroom door. We need walls. We need a defensible space." No one had a better idea. The thought of climbing those stairs, moving towards the source of that terrible sound, was horrifying. But the thought of staying on the ground floor, waiting for the front door to swing open again, was unbearable. Liam pulled a semi-catatonic Chloe to her feet, while Maya helped support the trembling Ben. Their small, terrified procession started up the stairs, their combined phone and flashlight beams creating a single, moving pool of light. The darkness of the central column seemed to press in on them, vast and empty and alive. Every step on the iron stairs was a loud, metallic clang that advertised their movement. With each upward spiral, the weeping grew louder, more present, as if the woman in the lantern room were leaning over the railing, watching their slow, frightened ascent. They could feel her eyes on their backs. They imagined long, dark hair trailing in the air above them. They reached the first floor landing, the location of Liam and Chloe's room. The weeping was a tangible presence now, a wave of pure misery washing down from above. "In here," Liam hissed, fumbling with the doorknob. He pushed the door open and herded them inside, sweeping his light across the small Spartan room. It was just as they had left it. A bed, a small wooden dresser, a single window looking out into the blackness. He shoved them all through the doorway and then immediately turned his attention to the door. "The dresser," he commanded. "Help me move it." Together, he and Ben, spurred by a fresh rush of adrenaline, dragged the heavy piece of antique furniture across the floor, its legs groaning in protest against the wood. They wedged it firmly against the door, creating a solid, reassuring barrier. For a moment, they could breathe. They were in a sealed room. They were safe. But the feeling did not last. The weeping from above slowly faded, the sound dwindling until it was gone completely. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was worse. It was a listening silence, a waiting silence. They huddled together in the middle of the floor, their flashlight beams intersecting, creating a pathetic island of light in a sea of oppressive darkness. They were trapped rats in a stone cage, and the cat was just outside the door. Then the whispers started. It began as a faint, sibilant hiss from the hallway, like the wind finding its way under the door. Then it coalesced into a voice, a soft, female voice, whispering a single name. "Maya." Maya gasped, her head snapping towards the door. "Did you hear that?" "We did not hear anything," Liam said, but his eyes were wide. The voice came again, clearer this time, impossibly close, as if the speaker's lips were pressed against the keyhole. It was the voice of an older woman, a voice warm with a phantom kindness that was utterly obscene in their current situation. "Maya, darling." "It is Mum. Open the door." I was so worried. Maya began to tremble, tears welling in her eyes. "My mother, she has been gone for 5 years, she whispered, her voice breaking. "It is a trick," Liam said, his voice a harsh rasp. "It is her. She is trying to get inside our heads." The voice changed. It became younger, the voice of a teenage boy. Benny, is that you? I fell. I think I broke my leg. Please, open the door, Benny. It is dark out here." Ben let out a choked sob. "That is my little brother Luke," he whispered, his face ashen. That is what he sounded like when he fell out of the treehouse. The entity was plucking their worst memories, their deepest loves, and twisting them into weapons. It was a cruel, intimate violation. They huddled closer together, a miserable knot of humanity under siege. Then came a new sound, a slow, deliberate scratching. It started at the top of the door and dragged its way down to the bottom. It was the sound of a single, long fingernail being drawn slowly, purposefully across the wood. The sound grated on their nerves, raising goosebumps on their skin. It stopped. A moment of silence followed. Then it started again, from the top, a rhythmic, patient, torturous sound designed to break them. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. Chloe, who had been silent for hours, began to whimper, rocking back and forth. As they stared, mesmerized in horror at the door, the old brass doorknob began to turn. It moved without a sound, slowly, smoothly, as if rotated by an invisible hand. It turned a full quarter rotation until it could go no further. It held there for a sickeningly long second, and then, just as slowly, it rotated back. A collective gasp filled the room. The scratching stopped. The knob began to rattle, gently at first, then with increasing violence. The door shook in its frame. The heavy dresser they had pushed against it vibrated, groaning as an immense unseen pressure was applied from the other side. Someone, or something, wanted to get in. It was no longer trying to trick them. It was trying to force its way through. "It cannot get in," Liam said, trying to convince himself as much as the others. "The dresser is too heavy." But even as he said it, the piece of furniture scraped backward an inch. The sound of wood dragging on wood, a screech of terror in the small room. In the midst of the chaos, Maya, who was clutching the keeper's logbook like a prayer book, noticed something. In her frantic grip, one of the brittle pages that had been stuck together at the back of the book had torn loose. It was a fragment. A piece of a page he must have hidden or written after the main log was finished. Shielding her phone's light from the others, she angled it down to read. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, the ink faded and watery. It looked as if he had written it with a failing pen, or perhaps something else entirely. It was not a proper entry, just a collection of desperate, fragmented thoughts. Night falls. Cannot see her now, only feel the cold she brings. She is drawn to sadness. My grief is a banquet for her. She feeds on our fear. It makes her strong. Maya's breath hitched. She read on, her eyes flying across the page. The sea took her body, but the stone claimed her echo. This tower is her cage and her grave. She cannot leave. She does not want to leave. She does not want to leave. She does not want to be alone. She wants company. She whispered it to me from the walls. She wants us to stay, all of us, forever. The final sentence chilled Maya to the bone. This was not a simple haunting. It was not a ghost with unfinished business. It was a predator, a lonely, malevolent entity that saw them as its property, new additions to its eternal, solitary misery. The rattling at the door suddenly stopped. The pressure ceased. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. They held their breath, listening, waiting. Chloe stood up. Her movements were stiff, puppet-like. Liam reached for her, but she moved with a strange, fluid grace that was not her own. Her eyes, wide and unblinking in the flashlight beams, were fixed on the window. "Chloe, what are you doing?" Liam whispered. "Sit down." She ignored him. She walked to the window that looked out over the churning Black Sea. She raised a hand and placed it gently against the cold glass. She stood there for a moment, her back to them, a slender silhouette against the impenetrable night. Then she spoke. The voice that emerged from her throat was not hers. It was a low, airy whisper, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was a woman's voice, but it was ancient, filled with the crushing weight of a century of sorrow. "He left me," the voice said through Chloe's lips. The words were quiet, but they resonated with a chilling power that filled the small room. The light went out. He left me all alone in the dark. Chloe's head tilted, a jerky, unnatural movement. "So cold," she whispered in that same alien voice. "Always so cold here, but soon there will be warmth. New friends to keep the chill away." Liam and Ben, snapping out of their horrified trance, rushed forward. They each grabbed one of Chloe's arms, trying to pull her away from the window. She resisted with a strength that was impossible. She was wiry and slender, but it was like trying to move a statue carved from granite. "Chloe, snap out of it," Liam yelled, his voice raw with panic. The thing wearing Chloe's body turned its head slowly to look at them. A faint, cruel smile played on her lips, a horrific distortion of her familiar face. "Chloe is not here," it whispered. With a sudden, violent shudder, Chloe's body went limp. The unnatural strength vanished, and she collapsed between them, a dead weight. Liam caught her, lowering her gently to the floor. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. She was herself again, but unconscious, drained by the entity that had used her. As Liam knelt over her, the temperature in the room plunged. It was not the gradual chill of a draft, but an instantaneous, shocking drop, as if they had been plunged into a walk-in freezer. Their breath fogged in the air, thick and white in their flashlight beams. A thin layer of frost, sparkling like diamond dust, began to form on the window pane. In the dead, freezing silence, a new sound began. It was not a whisper, not a scratch, not a rattle. It was a soft, wet, dripping sound. It came from the corner of the room, near the ceiling. Liam slowly raised his flashlight beam, his hand shaking so badly that the light trembled. The others followed his lead, their 3 beams converging on a single spot. High in the corner, where the curved wall met the ceiling, a dark stain was spreading across the stone. It was the color of brackish water, of old blood and seaweed. From the center of the stain, a thick, dark liquid was beginning to drip. It fell with a soft, rhythmic patter onto the wooden floor below. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop landed with a sickening little splash, the sound unnaturally loud in the frozen silence. A pool of the dark liquid was forming on the floor, spreading like a growing shadow. It did not soak into the wood, but sat on top of it, glistening like crude oil in their lights. It smelled of the deep ocean, of rot and decay and ancient salt. They stared, paralyzed by a new and visceral horror. The pool grew larger, darker. The dripping from the ceiling became faster, a steady stream now, as if a vessel had burst within the very stones of the lighthouse. And then, from the center of the spreading, noxious pool on the floor, something began to rise. It was not fast. It was a slow, deliberate emergence, like a nightmare crawling its way into the waking world. First, a shape that could have been a head, dark and rounded. Then, the suggestion of shoulders. It coalesced from the liquid shadow, a form taking shape where no form should be. It was the shape of a woman, made not of flesh and bone, but of shadow and sea damp and congealed despair. Their flashlight beams, trembling violently, illuminated the rising figure. They saw the outline of a slender body, the suggestion of a sodden, clinging garment. They saw long strands of what looked like dark, wet hair, plastered to a head that was still bowed, its face hidden in shadow. The figure rose to its full height, standing silently in the pool of its own making. The dripping from the ceiling stopped. The room was utterly still, utterly silent, save for their own choked, terrified breaths. Then the weeping began again. It was not an echo from the lantern room. It was not a memory in the walls. It was a raw, immediate sound of heart-stopping grief, and it was coming directly from the figure standing in the corner of the room, not 10 feet away from them. It was in the room with them. It was finally, horribly, here. Chapter 4, The Weeping Sound, was the anchor in a world that had dissolved into pure, shrieking chaos. Was the only constant. It was the sound of their own impending deaths. For a long, stretched out second, they were nothing but wide eyes and strangled breath, their flashlight beams trembling on the impossible figure that had risen from the floor. It was all there, just as Chloe had sketched, just as the logbook had described. The tall, slender form, the sodden garment that clung to it, the long, dark hair that fell like a curtain of black water. Then, with a movement that was unnervingly slow and graceful, the figure lifted its head. The face it revealed was not one of rot or decay. There were no empty sockets, no bared teeth. It was a face of smooth, pale, porcelain perfection, beautiful in its structure, but utterly devoid of life. It was a doll's face, a mask of profound sorrow. But the eyes were wrong. They were 2 pits of perfect polished blackness, voids that seemed to consume the light from their flashlights, drinking it in without a single reflection. There was no soul behind those eyes, only a cold, endless emptiness. The paralysis shattered. It was Ben who broke the silence, a high, thin scream tearing from his throat, the sound of a terrified animal. The creature Elara turned its blank, sorrowful face towards the sound. It took a step. It did not walk. Its feet were not visible. The lower half of its body was still a swirling column of brackish water and shadow that seemed to stain the very air. It glided, moving across the wooden floor with a silent, terrifying grace, leaving a wet, dark trail in its wake. It extended a hand. The hand was as pale and perfect as its face, with long, slender fingers that tapered to sharp, dark nails. The air around its outstretched limb shimmered and cracked with an intense, visible cold. It was moving towards Maya. She was the closest, still clutching the logbook to her chest like a useless shield. She tried to scramble backward, her legs tangled, her body refusing to obey the frantic commands of her brain. She was too slow. The entity's fingers brushed against her forearm. Maya's scream was a raw, agonizing shriek of pain that was nothing like Ben's cry of fear. Where the creature touched her, her skin instantly turned a mottled, necrotic grey. A spiderweb of frost bloomed across the sleeve of her jacket, the fabric freezing solid in an instant. She collapsed, clutching her arm, her body convulsing. It was not a burn. It was a cold so absolute, so profound, that it felt like her very life force was being siphoned away, her warmth replaced by the chilling touch of the grave. The sight of Maya falling, of the horrific speed and power of the entity, jolted Liam into action. The part of his brain that was still capable of thought screamed a single desperate imperative: escape. They could not fight this thing. They could not reason with it. The door, he roared, his voice a primal command. Ben, the dresser, move it, now. He threw himself against the heavy piece of furniture, his shoulder slamming into the wood. Ben, galvanized by Liam's command, joined him. They pushed with the frantic, superhuman strength of cornered animals, their feet slipping on the floorboards, their muscles screaming in protest. The dresser, which had seemed an immovable bulwark, now felt like a mountain. The entity turned its head, its black, empty eyes leaving Maya's writhing form to fix on them. The weeping sound it had been making subsided, replaced by a low hiss, like steam escaping a frozen pipe. It changed direction, gliding towards them, its hand once again outstretched. They had seconds. Maya, gasping on the floor, her face pale with shock and pain, saw it coming. She saw it gliding towards Liam and Ben, their backs to it as they struggled with the dresser. In a final, desperate act of defiance, she raised the keeper's logbook, the heavy, leather-bound volume that had been their guide into this nightmare, and threw it with all her remaining strength at the creature's head. The book sailed through the air and passed directly through the entity's face. There was no impact. It simply vanished into the form for a split second before emerging out the other side, tumbling to the floor with a wet smack. But as it passed through, there was a soft, sizzling sound, like water hitting a superheated pan, and the creature's form flickered, its edges momentarily losing their cohesion. It paused. The distraction had worked. It turned its terrible blank face back towards Maya. That single, vital second was all they needed. With a final, unified grunt of exertion, Liam and Ben shoved the dresser sideways just enough to clear the door. A gap, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, appeared. Liam glanced back. Chloe was still unconscious on the floor near the bed. The entity was starting to glide towards Maya again. He faced a choice that ripped his soul in two. "Chloe!" he screamed at Ben. "Get Chloe!" Ben did not hesitate. He scrambled past Liam, scooped the limp form of Chloe into his arms, and squeezed through the narrow opening into the dark hallway. Liam turned back. Maya was on her hands and knees, trying to crawl towards the door. The entity was between her and the exit, a gliding spectre of cold and shadow. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Maya's were wide with a terror that accepted its fate. "Go!" she screamed, her voice a ragged plea. "Just run, Liam." She tried to push herself up, to make a final dash for the opening. The entity was faster. Its pale hand shot out, the air crackling around it. Liam saw the fingers close around Maya's shoulder. He saw the frost explode across her back. He saw her face contort in a final, silent scream. His survival instinct, raw and brutal, took over. He turned and threw himself through the gap in the doorway, stumbling out onto the landing. He and Ben, who was struggling with Chloe's dead weight, grabbed the edge of the bedroom door and slammed it shut. The latch did not catch, but the displaced dresser on the other side held it for a moment. From within the room, Maya's scream, which had been silent, found its voice. It was a piercing, razor-sharp shriek of agony that lasted for 3 horrifying seconds before being abruptly, unnaturally cut off. Silence. Liam and Ben stood frozen outside the door, their chests heaving, their minds reeling. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than the scream itself. Then came a new noise from inside the room. A soft, wet, cracking sound. It was the sound of a frozen river breaking up in the spring thaw, the sound of ice shattering under immense pressure. It was followed by a dull, heavy thud, like a sack of frozen meat hitting the floor. And then, nothing. The silence returned, absolute and final. Maya was gone. A wave of nausea and grief washed over Liam, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had left her, he had run. He had left her in there to die. The guilt was a physical thing, a hot poker in his gut, but the fear was stronger. "We have to move," he gasped, his voice a choked whisper. He grabbed Ben's arm. "We have to get out of here. Now." Ben, his face a mess of tears and sweat, nodded dumbly. He adjusted his grip on Chloe, who was beginning to stir, moaning softly in her unconscious state. "Where do we go?" Ben whimpered. "Up or down?" Liam's mind raced. Up led to the lantern room, the entity's nest. Down led to the ground floor, to the unsecured main entrance. But down also led out of the suffocating confines of the tower. Down, Liam decided, his voice gaining a sliver of its old authority. "We get out of the tower. We will hide on the rocks. Anywhere but in here." They turned and plunged down the spiral staircase into the darkness below. It was a frantic, clumsy retreat. Ben led, half carrying, half dragging Chloe. Liam came behind, his phone's flashlight beam dancing erratically, his head constantly turned to look back up the stairs, fully expecting the bedroom door to burst open and the pale, gliding figure to come sweeping down after them. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The central column of the lighthouse felt like the gullet of some vast sleeping beast. The air was thick with the lingering cold of the entity's presence and the metallic tang of their own terror. They reached the bottom of the staircase and stumbled onto the ground floor. Liam swept his light across the cavernous room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He expected to see the main door still securely shut, the armchair wedged against it. He expected to have to fight his way out, but the door was open. It stood wide ajar, swinging gently back and forth in a breeze that did not exist. The heavy armchair he had wrestled into place was sitting back in its original position by the cold fireplace, as if it had never been moved. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It had all been a game. The entity had never been trapped outside. It had never needed to force the door. It had been herding them, manipulating them, trapping them in that upstairs room for its own cruel amusement. It wanted them to feel safe just before it tore that safety away. They stared at the open doorway, a black rectangle framing a world of pre-dawn gloom. Outside, the sea was still a violent chaos, great swells of black water rising up and crashing against the jagged rocks in explosions of white foam. The sound was a deafening, constant roar. Escape from the island was impossible. The waves would smash them to pieces against the shore. They had been driven out of the tower, but they had been driven into a larger prison. The entire island was their cage now. They stood there, hesitating in the doorway, caught between two impossible choices. Behind them lay the dark, silent tower, a vertical tomb that now held the body of their friend. In front of them lay the raging sea and the slippery, treacherous rocks, offering no shelter, no hope of rescue. Chloe began to regain consciousness, moaning softly in Ben's arms. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and unfocused. "Liam," she murmured, her voice weak. What happened? Where is Maya?" The question hung in the cold air, unanswered. Ben just shook his head, fresh tears streaming down his face. Liam could not bring himself to say the words. He could not tell her that Maya was dead because he had left her behind. We have to hide," Liam stammered, his mind a frantic, buzzing mess. "There is a small cove on the far side," Silas pointed it out. "Maybe we can shelter there until sunrise." It was a pathetic plan, born of sheer desperation, but it was the only one they had. They were exposed here, vulnerable. They had to move. Ben, his resolve crumbling, looked at Liam, his eyes pleading for an answer that did not exist. "What do we do?" he whimpered, his voice the cry of a lost child. "Liam, what are we supposed to do?" Liam opened his mouth to reply, to offer some useless reassurance, some lie about how they were going to be okay. But before he could speak, a new sound reached them. It came from high above, from the top of the spiral staircase, from the darkness they had just fled. It was the humming, the same sad, simple melody that Elara had hummed in life, the tune the stones had taught her. It drifted down the central column of the lighthouse, a clear, ethereal sound that cut through the roar of the sea. But the sound was different now. The deep, aching sorrow was gone. It was no longer a lament, stripped of its grief. The simple tune was something else entirely. It was playful, curious. It was the sound of a cat that has cornered a mouse and is settling in to enjoy its game. It was the sound of the hunt beginning anew. The three survivors stood frozen at the threshold of the lighthouse, the cold sea spray on their faces, the triumphant humming at their backs. They had nowhere left to run and nowhere left to hide. Chapter 5. The humming pursued them out into the half-light. It was a soundtrack for their terror, a delicate, maddening melody that clung to them as they stumbled from the oppressive dark of the lighthouse into the vast, roaring dark of the world outside. The rocks were slick with sea spray and a thin, treacherous layer of algae. Every step was a gamble. The wind tore at them, a physical assault that stole their breath and stung their eyes with salt. The sea was a churning cauldron of black water, waves hurling themselves against the islet with a percussive, thunderous violence that seemed to shake the very rock beneath their feet. Liam led the way, dragging Chloe by the hand, his phone's flashlight beam a frantic, bouncing guide in the gloom. He did not know where he was going, only that he had to get away from the tower, away from that triumphant hunting sound. The cove Silas had mentioned. It was a sliver of hope, a destination in a world that had become a featureless map of fear. Ben followed, staggering behind them, his face a pale, blank mask of shock. The loss of Maya, the physical confrontation with the impossible, had hollowed him out, leaving a shell that moved on pure, unthinking instinct. They found the cove on the far side of the islet, a jagged wound in the rock face, barely deep enough to offer shelter from the main force of the wind. They collapsed inside, their backs scraping against the rough, cold stone. It was no sanctuary. The roar of the ocean was still deafening, and the damp cold seeped into them instantly, chilling them to the bone. But it put a solid wall of granite between them and the lighthouse. For a moment, they were out of its sight. The humming stopped. The sudden silence was a new kind of terror. It was an attentive, listening silence. The game of cat and mouse had paused, and they were the mice, huddled in a crack in the wall, waiting for the cat to decide on its next move. Chloe, now fully conscious, began to shake violently. The reality of the last hour crashed down upon her. "Maya," she whispered, the name a ragged tear in the air. "Liam, where is she?" "We have to go back for her." Liam could not meet her eyes. He stared out at the grey, violent sea, the pre-dawn light doing little to illuminate the chaos. "We cannot, Chloe," he said, his voice raw. She is gone." The simple, brutal words were a death sentence. Chloe let out a sound that was not a cry or a sob, but a low, guttural moan of pure anguish. The sound of a soul breaking. She curled into herself, her grief a tangible thing in the small, cramped space. Ben began to rock back and forth, his arms wrapped around his knees, muttering to himself. "Not real," he chanted. his voice a low, rhythmic drone. Not real, not real. Just a bad dream. Gonna wake up. Liam felt the last of his strength, the last of his authority, crumbling away. He was the leader who had led them to their doom, the pragmatist who had denied the unbelievable until it had consumed one of his friends. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had run. He had left Maya to die. The memory of her final, terrified scream was a brand on his mind. He scanned the islet, what little he could see of it in the grim twilight. Black, jagged rocks, pools of churning seawater, and the ever-present monolith of the lighthouse, a dark grey needle against a paler grey sky. It dominated the landscape, a silent, malevolent god. Maya's words from the logbook echoed in his head. The stone claimed her echo. She was not just in the tower. The whole island was her domain. They had not escaped at all. They had just moved to a different room in their prison. As if summoned by his thoughts, a figure appeared. It was standing on the slick rocks near the open doorway of the lighthouse, a pale form in the gloom. It was a woman. She was wearing Maya's clothes, the dark jeans, the university hoodie. Maya. Liam breathed, his heart seizing in his chest. Was it possible? Had she somehow escaped? The figure turned its head towards them. It was Maya's face, but it was wrong. It was pale and slack, and her eyes were two pits of empty, polished black. A puppet, a grotesque parody of their friend. The thing wearing Maya's skin opened its mouth. No scream came out, only a rushing, gurgling sound, like a tide pulling away from the shore, the sound of a drowning lung. It raised a hand and gave a small, jerky wave, and then it dissolved, its form breaking apart into a million droplets of sea spray that were instantly snatched away by the wind. That was what broke Ben. The sight of their friend, her body desecrated, used as a tool of terror, shattered the last fragile remnants of his sanity. He screamed, a long, tearing shriek of pure, undiluted madness. No more, he shrieked, scrambling to his feet. I am not staying here. I am not letting her get me. He lunged out of the cove, back onto the open rocks, his eyes fixed on the raging sea. I am going home. Ben, no, Liam yelled, launching himself after him. Ben was running, slipping and sliding on the treacherous rocks, heading directly for the edge where the waves were crashing with the most force. He was going to throw himself in. He was choosing the certainty of the ocean over the horror of the ghost. Liam tackled him just a few feet from the edge. They went down hard, their bodies slamming against the jagged, unforgiving rock. Ben fought with a wild, hysterical strength, his fists flailing, his legs kicking. Let me go, he screamed, his voice dissolving into sobs. Let me go, let me go. Stop it, Liam grunted, trying to pin him down. You will kill yourself. She has already killed me, Ben sobbed, his fight suddenly draining away, replaced by a shuddering, hopeless despair. It was then that the sea rose up to meet them. A wave, monstrous and unnaturally large, reared up from the churning surface. It was a solid wall of black water, twice the size of any that had come before it, as if the ocean itself had reached out a hand for them. Chloe screamed a warning from the cove, but it was too late. The wave crashed over them with the force of a freight train. The world became a roaring, freezing, violent chaos of white water and black pressure. Liam's grip on Ben was torn away. He felt himself being lifted, scraped across the rocks, and then plunged into the icy water. He tumbled end over end, his lungs burning, before his feet found purchase, and he fought his way back to the surface, gasping and sputtering. The wave receded with a powerful, sucking roar. Liam was left clinging to a rock, his body battered and bruised, the cold already seeping deep into his bones. He looked around wildly. "Ben!" he screamed. He saw him. He was 20 feet out, caught in the violent pull of the undertow. He was flailing, his head barely above the surface, his face a mask of pure terror. "Liam," he cried, his voice swallowed by the roar of the sea. Another wave, smaller this time, washed over him, pulling him under. He vanished beneath the black, churning water. Liam watched, helpless, his heart a block of ice in his chest. Ben surfaced one last time, further out now. His arms were no longer flailing. He was just a dark shape, his head tilted back, his mouth open in a silent scream at the indifferent, grey sky. Then a third wave rolled over him, and he was gone. Liam stared at the spot where his friend had been, at the violent, empty water. He waited for him to reappear. He prayed for him to reappear, but there was nothing, only the endless, crashing waves. Ben was gone, taken by the sea, or taken by her. Now there were two. The loss of Ben, so swift, so brutal, so absolute, extinguished the last ember of hope in Liam's soul. They were not going to be rescued. They were not going to survive by hiding. The island, the lighthouse, the very sea around them were all her weapons. She would toy with them, torment them, and then pick them off one by one until none were left. He staggered back to the cove, his clothes plastered to his skin, his body shaking uncontrollably with cold and shock. Chloe just stared at him, her eyes wide, her face utterly devoid of expression. She had seen it all. He collapsed beside her, the fight gone out of him. They were going to die here, on this miserable, God-forsaken rock. He leaned his head back against the stone and closed his eyes, waiting for the end. And then he heard it again, the humming. It was soft, and it was close. Not from the lighthouse this time, but from just outside the cove, as if she was standing there, watching them, savoring their despair. The playful, triumphant melody was the cruelest torture of all. Something inside Liam snapped. The grief, the guilt, the terror, it all coalesced and combusted into a single, final, desperate emotion. Rage. A pure, hopeless, suicidal rage. He would not die like this, huddled in a hole, waiting to be slaughtered. If he was going to die, he would die fighting. Not fighting her, he knew that was impossible, but fighting what gave her power. The logbook, the light, Thomas Weaver's words came back to him. I must put out the other light. The one in my own head, a metaphor for suicide, he had thought. But what if it was not? Elara's whisper through Chloe's lips. The light went out. He left me all alone in the dark. Everything came back to the light. Its absence was her strength. Its presence was her pain. A plan, insane and desperate, formed in his mind. "Chloe," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. She did not respond, just continued to stare blankly. He grabbed her shoulder, forcing her to look at him. "Chloe, listen to me. We are going back." "Back," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "Back inside," he said, his eyes wild. "Back to the top, to the lantern room." "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "No, Liam, she will kill us. She is going to kill us anyway," he yelled, his voice cracking. "We cannot hide. We cannot escape. Our only chance is to go right at her, at the source." He was thinking out loud now, the desperate logic taking shape. "She is tied to this place, to the light. What if we can turn it on?" Ben found the switch, the emergency beacon. "What if we can turn it on?" Light against dark, Chloe. It is all we have left. He saw a flicker of something in her deadened eyes. Not hope. It was too late for hope. But a flicker of resolve, of fight. They were going to die either way. They could die cowering on the rocks, or they could die on their feet, trying to destroy the thing that was hunting them. She gave a single, slow nod. The journey back to the lighthouse was a grim pilgrimage. The humming followed them, a constant mocking presence that seemed to slither on the wind. They reached the open doorway and paused, peering into the black, silent maw of the tower. To step back inside was an act of supreme will, a deliberate choice to walk back into the belly of the beast. They entered. The air was frigid, thick with a palpable malevolence. The silence was absolute. The humming had stopped the moment they crossed the threshold. She was waiting for them. The ascent up the spiral staircase was an agony of suspense. Every creaking step was a cannon shot in the stillness. They moved slowly, their bodies pressed against the central column, as far from the outer wall and its deep shadows as possible. They held their breath, listening, straining their ears for any sound. They felt her presence all around them, a pressure in the air, a whisper of movement in the corner of their vision, a sudden drop in temperature that would last for a heart-stopping second and then vanish. They passed the first floor landing, the door to the room where Maya had died still slightly ajar. They did not look. They just kept climbing up and up into the heart of the darkness. Finally, they reached the top. The narrow door to the lantern room stood open. A cold, grey light filtered out. With a shared, shuddering breath, they stepped through. The room was as Ben had described it, a circular chamber of glass and iron, with the massive dead lens at its center. The cold was so intense it was a physical pain, stinging their lungs and burning their skin. She was there. She was standing by the lens, her back to them, one pale hand resting on the grime-covered glass. Her form was more solid now, less ethereal, as if their fear had given her substance, anchoring her more firmly to the world. She turned, slowly, Her porcelain face was impassive, but her black, empty eyes fixed on them, and in their depths they saw a bottomless, ancient hatred. The air crackled, and the temperature dropped even further. Liam's eyes darted to the wall, searching for the emergency beacon. He saw it, the metal box, the red switch. It was on the far side of the room. He would have to go past her to get to it. He took a step. Elara moved to block his path, gliding silently, her gaze never leaving his. He was trapped, but she was not looking at Chloe. Chloe, moving with a sudden feral burst of energy, scrambled to the side. Her eyes were scanning the floor, searching for a weapon, anything. She saw it, a heavy iron wrench, nearly 2 feet long, left behind from some long-forgotten maintenance. She snatched it up, its weight a solid, reassuring thing in her trembling hands. She did not run at the ghost. She ran at the lens. With a raw, grief-fueled scream, she swung the heavy wrench with all her might, aiming for the central prism, the heart of the massive glass structure. The sound of the impact was a deafening, explosive crack, like a bolt of lightning striking the tower. A web of fractures instantly appeared on the thick glass. Elara shrieked. It was not a sound of sorrow or weeping. It was a high, piercing, agonized scream of pure, undiluted rage and pain. It was as if Chloe had struck the entity herself. Her ghostly form flickered violently, distorting like a bad television signal. Liam stared, and in a flash of horrified understanding, he saw the truth. She was not just in the lighthouse. She was the lighthouse. Her lonely, bitter echo was fused with the place. Her soul bound to the lens, the very object that had been the focus of her husband's life and the symbol of her own solitary madness. The realization gave him a new, terrible purpose. He abandoned any thought of the switch and joined Chloe at the lens. He found a loose iron rod on the floor. "Smash it," he roared. "Smash it all." Together, they unleashed their grief and terror upon the glass. They swung their makeshift weapons again and again, their movements frantic and desperate. With each shattering blow, the ghost screamed, her form twisting and writhing in the air. The lantern room became a cacophony of destruction, the sharp crack of shattering glass, the grunts of exertion from Liam and Chloe, and the unholy, spectral shrieks of the dying ghost. Tendrils of black energy and freezing cold lashed out from her disintegrating form, striking the walls and shattering the glass panes of the room itself. The wind howled through the new openings. The entity was fighting back, its death throes shaking the very foundations of the tower. However, they did not stop. Fueled by a desperate, vengeful fury, they worked relentlessly, bringing the heavy iron down again and again, reducing the magnificent, 100-year-old lens to a glittering pile of sharp, useless shards. As the last large piece of the central prism shattered and fell to the floor, Elara's form exploded. It blew apart into a raging, silent storm of spectral light and shadow that filled the room for a single blinding moment. Then it was gone. The shrieking stopped. The unnatural cold vanished, replaced by the simple damp chill of the sea air. Liam and Chloe stood in the wreckage, their chests heaving, their hands bloody, surrounded by the glittering debris of the shattered lens. They were alone, For the first time since they had arrived, the lighthouse was just a tower of cold, empty stone. Chapter 6. The silence in the lantern room was a deafening physical thing. It was heavier than the roar of the sea, more profound than the shrieking of the ghost. It was the silence of an ending, a silence of death. Liam and Chloe stood amidst the wreckage, their bodies screaming with a pain that went far beyond their cuts and bruises. The floor was a glittering carpet of broken glass, the last remnants of the magnificent lens that had been the heart of the tower. They had destroyed it. They had shattered the ghost's anchor, and in the ensuing explosion of spectral energy, she had vanished. Their chests heaved, sucking in air that was no longer unnaturally cold. The oppressive, malevolent presence that had saturated the very stones of the lighthouse was gone. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they were alone. The first rays of the rising sun pierced through the shattered panes of the lantern room. The light was pale and golden, a stark contrast to the grim, bruised twilight that had held them captive. It was the light of a new day, but it brought no warmth, no comfort. It was a harsh, unforgiving light that illuminated the devastation around them and the hollowed-out horror in each other's eyes. They were survivors. The word felt like a lie. They were just the ones left behind. Without a word, they turned and began the long descent. Their final journey down the spiral staircase was a ghost walk. Their footsteps, which had been so frantic and terrified before, were now the slow, shuffling steps of the condemned. The tower felt different. It was just a building now, a dead shell of stone and iron, its malevolent soul exorcised. But the memory of the terror was an invisible film on every surface, a stain on the very air. They reached the first floor landing. The door to Maya's room, it would always be Maya's room, was still ajar. A thick, dark, brackish stain marred the floorboards of the hallway outside it, a gruesome marker of where the entity had manifested. Neither of them looked inside the room. They could not. To see what was left of their friend, to confront the physical evidence of their failure to save her, was a horror they could not face. They hurried past, the image of Maya's last terrified scream seared into their minds. The weight of their dead friends was a physical burden, heavier than their exhaustion. They reached the ground floor. The massive oak door, the portal to their nightmare, still stood wide open, a welcoming gesture that was now a sick irony. They stepped out of the tower and back into the world. The sea was calmer now. The storm had passed, and the violent, crashing waves had subsided into a powerful, rhythmic swell. The sky, scrubbed clean by the wind, was a vast, empty expanse of pale blue. It felt alien, like the sky of a different planet. They found a relatively flat rock, sheltered from the wind, and sat down to wait. They did not speak. Words were useless things, too small and clumsy to contain the enormity of what they had endured. What could they possibly say? I am sorry I left her. I can still hear his scream. I will never be clean of this. So they sat in silence, two strangers bound by a shared, unspeakable trauma. They watched the sun climb higher in the sky, its warmth doing nothing to touch the profound, permanent cold that had settled deep within their bones. They were survivors, but they felt like ghosts. haunting the shores of their own shattered lives. Sunday noon seemed an eternity away. They had no concept of time, of how many hours had passed since the sun had risen. Every minute was a slow, painful crawl. And then a speck, a tiny, dark speck on the distant, glittering horizon. It grew steadily larger, resolving itself into the familiar shape of a fishing trawler. It was Silas. He was early, days early. As his boat, the sea serpent, chugged closer, they could see him standing at the helm, his weathered face grim. He must have seen the shattered glass of the lantern room from a mile out. He must have known that something was wrong. He navigated the boat expertly to the small, crude dock. He threw a rope and tied it off without a word. He looked at them, at their two battered forms huddled on the rocks. He looked at Liam's torn, soaked clothes and the blood on Chloe's hands. He saw the ghosts of the two who were missing in the hollows of their eyes. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask where the others were. His silence was not one of indifference. It was a heavy, knowing silence. The silence of a man who had heard stories his whole life, who had warned them not to go, who knew the dark reputation of St. Jude's Folly. His gaze was not one of pity, but of a grim, weary confirmation of what he already suspected. "Time to go," he grunted, his voice the same gravelly rasp as before. He helped them onto the boat. His hand was rough and calloused, a brief solid touch of reality in their nightmare world. They sat on a wooden crate in the stern, huddling together not for warmth, but as if to shield each other from the sight of the lighthouse. Silas turned the boat, and the engine rumbled to life. They pulled away from the island. The lighthouse grew smaller, shrinking on the horizon until it was once again just a grey stone needle against the sky, a monument to their loss and their terror. Neither of them looked back. The journey to the mainland passed in a silent, merciful blur. The authorities were waiting. Silas must have called them. Police officers, paramedics. They were wrapped in blankets, checked for injuries, their physical wounds laughably superficial compared to the ones that would never heal. They told a story, a fractured, edited version of the truth. They spoke of the storm, of a freak wave that had swept Ben into the sea. They talked about Maya, about a terrible, tragic fall down the iron staircase in the dark. They lied because the truth was a raving, impossible madness. Who would believe a story of a weeping ghost that fed on sorrow and could freeze a person's soul with a touch? They would be locked away. They were treated as victims. Two young people were suffering from profound shock, their minds understandably confused by the trauma. A search and rescue team was dispatched. They found nothing. The sea, Silas said with grim certainty, rarely gives back what it takes near the Folly. Ben and Maya were officially listed as missing, presumed dead. It was a tragic accident, a weekend getaway that had turned into an unspeakable tragedy. The world tried to welcome them back. Friends and family surrounded them with a suffocating, useless sympathy. They went through the motions of life, but the gears were broken. The color had been leached from their world, replaced by shades of grey. The shared trauma did not bind Liam and Chloe together. It became a chasm between them. Every time they looked at each other, they saw the reflection of their own horror. They saw Maya's ghost and heard Ben's final scream. They stopped speaking, and then they stopped seeing each other altogether. Their love story, like the lives of their friends, had become another casualty of the lighthouse. Months passed. The seasons changed. Liam was consumed by a quiet, gnawing guilt. He dropped out of university. He worked a mindless job stacking shelves at a grocery store, the monotony a welcome anesthetic. He did not sleep, or when he did, he would be back in the tower, the sound of a fingernail scratching on a wooden door waking him up in a cold sweat. He would see a pale porcelain face in the shadows of his room, its black empty eyes staring at him from a place beyond death. He had run. He had left her. The words were his nightly penance. Chloe retreated into a fortress of silence. She who had once found such joy in creation no longer touched a pencil or a paintbrush. Her hands, which used to be so steady, now had a constant fine tremor. She would spend hours staring at her own reflection in a darkened window, haunted by the memory of another's voice in her throat, another's thoughts in her mind. She felt permanently stained, a vessel that had been used and discarded, leaving a residue of ancient coldness behind. One night, unable to bear the screaming silence of his apartment, Liam found himself online, typing St. Jude's Folly into a search bar. He did not know what he was looking for, an explanation, an absolution. He found an old digitized newspaper article from the local archives, dated 1927. The headline read, "Lighthouse Keeper in Tragic Fall." He read the short article. It detailed the death of Thomas Weaver, the last keeper. The official cause of death was an accidental fall from the lantern room during a violent storm. He was presumed to have been trying to repair the light mechanism, but the article included a small final paragraph. It was a quote from the fisherman who had found the body, a man named Alistair Finch. Silas's grandfather found him at the base of the tower at low tide. The quote read, "A terrible sight, but the strangest thing I ever saw, the lens, the big glass from the lantern room. It was all smashed to pieces, and every last shard of it was lying on the rocks around his body, like it had exploded right out of the top. I never could figure that one out." Liam's blood ran cold. He read the words again and again, a deep, bone-shaking dread, a feeling he had hoped was gone forever, washed over him. Thomas Weaver had done the same thing. He had fought back. He had smashed the lens to destroy the echo of his wife, and it had not worked. He had still died. The realization was a punch to the gut. They had not defeated her. They had not destroyed her. They had just annoyed her. They had broken her anchor, her focal point, and in doing so had done the one thing Thomas Weaver never could. They had set her free. Destroying the lens did not kill the echo. It just untethered it from the stone. The Folly was her cage, and they had opened the door. Miles away in her silent apartment, Chloe stood up and walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water. A sudden, inexplicable chill ran down her spine, raising goosebumps on her arms. She paused and looked at her faint reflection in the dark glass of the kitchen window. For for a single, horrifying heartbeat, the reflection was not her own. She saw two figures in the glass, herself in the foreground, and standing just behind her, a tall, slender woman with long, dark hair that fell forward, obscuring her face. Chloe gasped and spun around. The kitchen was empty. She was alone. But she knew with a certainty that was as cold and absolute as a tombstone that she was not. The haunting was not over. The ghost of Elara Weaver, drawn to the deep, resonant grief and terror of the only two people to ever escape her grasp, had followed them. The Folly was her grave, but their traumatized minds were her new home. And this time, there was no island to leave behind, no tower to flee. This time, there was nowhere left to run.